So this is the iPhone SE 2020, Apple's newest budget offering that I actually took a look at a couple of weeks ago, and I really liked it. I thought it was a great value phone for people who wanted to get a new iPhone without breaking the bank. And this is my personal, old faithful iPhone 10. This has been my personal phone for the longest time now, and at this point, you can get it for around $400. And seeing as quite a few of you have actually requested this video, I think it's time to find out which of these two phones you should buy in 2020. Let's find out. First of all, we're going to be starting, as we usually do, by taking a look at the specs. Now, there are some areas where these two phones are actually pretty similar, with both actually featuring the same 3GB of RAM. However, there are also some areas where these phones are radically different, such as the processor. The SE features the A13 Bionic processor, which is actually the same processor used in the highest end current iPhone, which is kinda crazy, whereas the iPhone 10 has the A11 Bionic processor. Now, because of that processor, there are of course going to be some differences in performance. However, not as significantly as there were when the iPhone 11 series used this processor. It does make a difference though nonetheless, and we are going to be talking about that in more detail later on. As I previously said, both phones feature 3GB of RAM and multiple storage options, with the iPhone SE having 64, 128, and 256GB storage options, whereas on the iPhone 10, it still has that 64 and 256GB options, but it's missing that middle ground. Now, me personally, I have both these phones in 64GB, and I personally never even get close to filling that up, but it's a good option nonetheless. In terms of weight, the iPhone 10 weighs in at a pretty heavy 174 grams, whereas the iPhone SE weighs in at a much lighter 148 grams, and this is noticeable. Throughout my usage, I've never personally found the iPhone 10 to be too heavy. In fact, I personally quite like the added weight. I just think it makes it feel a little bit more premium in my opinion. But if you want a light phone, the 10 is probably not a good option. As for the key specs, with the exception of the screen, because that gets its own section later, that's pretty much it. Honestly, I do have to give the win to the SE here. I mean, the A13 upgrade is just so significant. That said, we are going to be talking in more detail about how each of these phones performs later on, so guess we'll find out how much of a difference it really made. In terms of build quality, despite the difference in appearance, they're actually pretty similar. Both phones feature a glass back, metal sides, with the SE having aluminium sides, and the 10 having steel sides, which I personally prefer due to that added weight. As I said, I just think it feels a bit more premium. Both also feature that IP67 water resistance rating, which means that both are rated to survive for up to 30 minutes in up to a meter of water. And this is a pretty useful failsafe. I've definitely used this a couple of times now. All in all, very similar. And honestly, this is both a pro and a con. It's good because they both feel really nice and premium, but because of the glass, both are pretty damn fragile. Because of this, I always recommend getting a case. But all in all, as I said at the start, build quality is actually very similar, which honestly is more of a good thing than it is a bad thing. After this, we have the screen, and I honestly think this is probably where one of the biggest differences are between these phones. The iPhone 10's rocking that modern 5.8-inch 2436 by 1125 OLED display with a PPI of 458 and an absolute peak brightness, so best case scenario, of 809 nits. However, the iPhone SE took that classic 4.7-inch 16:9 approach with a resolution of 1334 by 750 and a peak brightness of 326 nits. As I said before, the aspect ratio is actually pretty radically different, with the classic 16:9 on the SE and the 10 having this odd 19.5:9, very weird widescreen aspect ratio. And weird as it may be, I personally love it. In terms of real-world performance, as I said in my SE review, I didn't actually really care about the lack of resolution. At the distance I like to use my phone, which is about that. Honestly, I really don't think it's an issue. Colors and contrast, however, are pretty different. But the biggest thing I missed when exclusively using the SE was that aspect ratio. Honestly, at this point, 16:9 does just feel a little dated, with a lot of videos actually being shot in 18:9 nowadays, such as this one. And I actually just prefer this look. It looks a lot more modern, despite the 10 being released almost exactly 2.5 years ago. Another thing I personally prefer on the 10 over the SE is simply the 3D touch. The 10R, 11 series, and SE all traded this for the haptic touch, which actually operates on time press rather than pressure, which not only feels a little bit slower, but let's be honest, is way less technologically cool. I mean, let's be honest, pressure sensing, pretty awesome. In comparison, time pressed, it's kind of boring. Granted, I can use both just fine, and I've more or less accepted that haptic touch is the future, but still, there's just something special about 3D touch. All in all, here, the 10 takes a clear win. In fact, the screen seems to be better in almost every way. Following on, we have the button layout, which is actually quite different. On the iPhone 10, we have, due to that lack of the home button, the more modern layout with the multifunction lock button, separate volume buttons, and mute switch. On the SE, we still have those separate volume buttons and mute switch. However, lock button has that classic binding of click to lock and hold to power off, and all those slightly obscure functions have pretty much exclusively returned to the home button. Both sets feel just as good as each other, honestly. I do like the larger lock button on the iPhone 10, but I way prefer the layout on the iPhone SE. So honestly, there aren't any real winners here, mostly just preference. Up next, we have the unlock methods, which are actually totally different for both. The iPhone SE has that classic Touch ID, whereas the iPhone 10 was the first iPhone ever to include Face ID. The Touch ID works as well as ever on the iPhone SE, with it being fast, accurate, and probably the best touch-based system Apple has ever released. However, the Face ID just feels a lot more modern because, well, it is. It's also fast and accurate, however, you can't use it unless you look directly at it, unlike on the iPhone 11. So in terms of ease of use, I honestly have to say with these two phones, the SE is more user-friendly, but which do I prefer? I personally prefer the Face ID. I'm rarely in a situation where I need to unlock my phone and can't look at it, on top of how much more modern it feels. That said, I honestly do have to say this one comes down to preference. Following on from this, we have the camera. Initially, a clear difference we can see is that the iPhone 10 has 2 cameras, whereas the iPhone SE only has 1. So the iPhone 10 wins by default. Well, not exactly. In terms of specs, the iPhone 10 has 2 previously mentioned separate focal lengths on a 12 megapixel sensor, standard, and 2x zoom. The 1x zoom has an aperture of f1.8, whereas the 2x zoom has an aperture of f2.4. The iPhone SE, on the other hand, has the wide angle with the same f1.8 aperture, again with the 12 megapixel sensor, but when we start to actually look at the photos, it's pretty clear that there's a significant difference. In terms of dynamic range and sharpness, as we can see here, the SE is so far ahead of the iPhone 10. Now, this is partly due to the A13 processor. It's not quite as big as a difference as we saw on the iPhone 11, but still big difference here. In terms of versatility, obviously the iPhone 10 is going to win. It has another focal length that I actually really like. As I've said in the past, for taking pictures of focused landscapes, people, or architecture, that 2x zoom is actually really good. If you want to see that in practice, then I suggest checking that video out up there. But in summary, I use that 2x zoom a lot. Colors also look a little better on the iPhone SE with some nice levels of saturation, and overall skin tones were better than on the iPhone 10. I've always found the skin tones to look a little grey on the iPhone 10, but on the SE they look rich, realistic, and just overall better. In terms of portrait mode, this is actually where the iPhone 10 took a pretty huge lead. While it lacks the aperture slider to adjust the level of background blur and is limited to the tele lens, it can be used on more than just people, which is awesome. I always love using the portrait mode in the iPhone 10 to fake that blurry background, because despite the fast aperture, it's actually pretty difficult to get it any other way, simply due to the sensor limitations. When you can use it on the iPhone SE, it does work well, but yeah, still, in this department, the 10 just works so much better. In terms of the front-facing camera, they're both practically identical. They're both 7 megapixels, and they both just look okay. Good for selfies, better color and dynamic range on the SE, but not by much, and if you really want quality, probably shouldn't use it. Moving on, in terms of shooting video, both these phones shoot 4K at up to 60 FPS and slow motion 1080p at up to 240 FPS. For the longest time now, the iPhone 10 has helped me get some really good looking video, especially as far as phone video quality goes. I love the 4K 60 FPS for some lovely smooth handheld shots, and the slow motion, while not terrifically high quality, is useful in a pinch. On this iPhone SE, however, it's actually a little better. You can actually get extended dynamic range in video up to 30 FPS, which in my opinion looks awesome. It does make a difference, and when you're dealing with sensors this small, I'm gonna take pretty much all the dynamic range I can get. In terms of slow motion for the SE, well, it's still not great quality. The 120p does for sure look better, but that 240 FPS is as muddy as ever. So if you want good quality slow motion, you really should be shooting 120 FPS. Either way, for video, both are pretty good, but honestly, they're still a huge way off replacing actual cameras. However, this isn't the case for photography. As I've said before, I often find myself using this far more than I use this for some casual photos. It's just such an easy, nice, intuitive camera to use, and all in all, taking photos on my phone is a lot of fun. Now, of course, as I said before, this isn't the case for video. I still think smartphones have a long way to go in terms of video. It just still looks a little bit plasticky. That said, I'm optimistic for the future of smartphone video, and hopefully we'll see something really good soon. Moving on, we probably have one of the most important aspects of any phone, OS and app performance. As the iPhone SE was released in 2020 with iOS 13, it will most likely last up until iOS 18, whereas the iPhone 10 was released in 2017, so this will most likely last until iOS 16. This is a pretty substantial difference, honestly, with the SE certainly getting better OS support, but at the same time, both are still gonna last a pretty long time. In terms of OS performance, both are stellar. Scrolling through the OS, opening up apps, and all the stock functionalities work pretty great. That said, there is still an error with the iPhone SE where you can't haptic touch on notifications. Hopefully they get this fixed through software updates. That would be useful. I actually expected that fix to be out by now. Hopefully it comes out soon. The iPhone 10, however, has now been out so long that everything feels mature, and honestly, I think that's why I keep coming back to this phone. everything works. In terms of performance, as of now, both work pretty great. Streaming high-resolution video was not a problem, and playing casual games was a very smooth experience on both. That said, when it came down to the more intensive games, the iPhone SE did take a slight lead, but most of the time, both were absolutely fine. So yeah, in summary, while the iPhone SE does technically perform better, because it's a new release, it does still have a couple of those early on bugs. And yeah, as of now, the iPhone X is just a more stable experience. That said, if Apple's usual 5-year support cycle is true, the iPhone SE will definitely outlast the iPhone X. So yeah, overall, I gotta give this round to the iPhone SE. Up next, we have the speaker performance, which, to be honest, isn't all that important. I mean, honestly, if you need good quality, you really shouldn't be listening on phone speakers. You should really be listening on like a good pair of headphones or speakers. That said, both have the stereo technology that we saw introduced on the iPhone 7. This is where both the top and the bottom speaker are used in conjunction. On both, it's nicely balanced, and all in all, it just makes the sound feel a bit more full. Now, the iPhone SE did sound a bit more full when listening, and therefore a little louder, but all in all, both will be nice for some casual listening. Finally, we have battery life. The iPhone X has a battery capacity of 2,760 mAh, whereas the SE has a battery capacity of 1,821 mAh. So a pretty substantial difference as far as specs are concerned. As for how well they actually perform, well, at the moment, it's about the same with a slight edge to the 10. That said, I've been using the 10 for ages now, and the SE has just been released. So despite that new A13 Bionic processor optimizing battery usage, as well as excellent standby preservation, seriously, leave this thing locked, it'll last. The 10 is still slightly better, and if both were brand new, I'd have no doubt that the 10 would win. Both can last me a full day, however, I do usually need to plug them in the evening, and honestly, I don't really mind this, so in my opinion, both are totally usable. That said, the 10 definitely wins this one. Alright, so now we've covered all the important areas, which of these two phones should you buy in 2020? It's pretty clear to me that these phones have different markets. The SE is, as I said at the start, a competitively priced phone that you can buy new without breaking the bank. So honestly, I think this phone will be for most people. Most people just need a phone that works well, looks nice, and takes good photos. And in my opinion, the SE checks all those boxes. That said, the iPhone X is still the more power user-esque phone, so long as you don't mind buying refurbished or second-hand. The screen's better, there's a second camera, and it has some of those more modern features like Face ID. So I think to power users who want an iPhone but don't want to spend a lot of money, the iPhone X could be a good option. Alright guys, so as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, and smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.